If you think a funeral is a place where the world finally slows down, you have never seen a moment like this unfold in silence. The sky over a quiet American neighborhood was heavy with gray clouds as people gathered in respectful stillness to honor a young life gone too soon, and among them stood a mother named Alicia Monroe, dressed in black, holding herself together with the kind of strength only a parent can understand. She was not loud, not dramatic, not seeking attention, just present in a way that made the air feel heavier around her, while neighbors and family members kept their distance out of respect for her grief. Near the edge of the gathering stood Officer Daniel Carter, a uniformed police officer known in the area for following procedure strictly, watching the scene with a cautious expression that suggested he believed he was maintaining order. No one there could have guessed that this quiet moment was about to shift in a direction that would later be spoken about in disbelief across the entire community. Alicia Monroe had come to this place carrying the weight of a personal loss that no system or authority could measure, and her eyes stayed fixed on the small memorial arranged for her son, every detail reminding her of memories that words could not fully contain. Officer Carter received a request to approach the situation due to a misunderstanding involving identification verification near the perimeter of the gathering, and he moved forward with a professional but firm posture, not yet realizing who he was about to engage with. When he spoke, his tone was controlled and procedural, asking for cooperation and clarity, while Alicia responded calmly, her voice steady but carrying the exhaustion of grief. The interaction drew attention, not because of chaos, but because of the tension that forms when misunderstanding meets emotional vulnerability in a public space. What no one present understood in that moment was that Alicia Monroe was not only a grieving mother, but a federal judge who had spent her life interpreting law with precision and fairness, a fact that remained completely unknown to Officer Carter as he continued his procedural questioning. The people around began to shift uneasily, sensing the weight of authority and sorrow colliding in a way that felt deeply uncomfortable, yet still contained within the boundaries of calm dialogue. Alicia's expression never changed from composed grief, even as she reached slowly for her identification, her hand steady despite everything she was feeling inside. The air seemed to pause as documents were reviewed, and Officer Carter's demeanor subtly shifted from routine professionalism to quiet reconsideration as he processed what he was seeing, though he had not yet fully realized the depth of the situation. No one spoke loudly, no one interrupted, and the funeral continued in the background like a distant echo, while this small moment of misunderstanding expanded into something that would soon challenge assumptions and reveal truths no one expected. In that fragile intersection of grief, authority, and identity, a story was already unfolding that would change the way those present understood the person standing quietly in front of them. The air outside the small chapel felt heavier than usual, not because of weather, but because of silence that carried too much meaning. There are moments when authority is invisible until the world forces it to be seen. Inside, mourners moved slowly, each step measured, each breath restrained, as the community gathered to honor a young man whose life had ended far too soon. At the center of it all stood a black woman in her late 40s, composed yet visibly carrying a weight that no one around her could fully measure. Her name was Judge Alicia Carter, though here, in this place of grief, titles were not spoken aloud. She wore a simple black dress, her posture steady, her eyes focused on the closed casket that held her only son. Outside, the parking lot was beginning to fill with vehicles, and among them arrived a police cruiser that did not belong to the ceremony. Officer Brandon Miller stepped out first, followed by his partner, both scanning the area with a sense of routine authority that had become second nature. They had been called for a possible disturbance, a vague report that lacked detail but demanded response according to procedure. The officers approached the entrance, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere near the doorway. Conversations lowered, movement slowed, and attention subtly redirected toward them. Inside, Judge Carter remained unaware of the approaching tension, her focus still anchored to the memory of her son, the years of his life compressed now into photographs and flowers arranged beside him. The chapel doors opened, and the change was immediate. Officer Miller scanned the room, his eyes passing over faces until they landed on a small group near the front where voices had grown slightly raised in grief and disagreement about funeral arrangements. He interpreted the energy as disorder, stepping forward with a firm voice instructing the room to settle. The instruction was not loud, but it carried the weight of expectation. Judge Carter turned slowly at the sound, her expression calm but alert, observing the officers as they moved further inside without hesitation. The situation began to tighten as questions were asked, responses misunderstood, and assumptions formed in seconds that no one paused to correct. Around her, family members looked toward her for reassurance, unaware that her identity held a level of authority far beyond what was visible in this moment. Officer Miller, focused on control of the environment, did not recognize her. He saw only a grieving mother in a crowded space, not the federal judge whose decisions had shaped cases across the state. As the interaction continued, the emotional pressure in the room grew not through conflict, but through misunderstanding led upon grief. Judge Carter finally spoke, her voice steady, asking for clarity and respect for the occasion. The officer responded formally, still unaware of who she was, maintaining procedural tone as if addressing an ordinary situation. It was in this exchange that the imbalance became most apparent, not through action, but through the distance between perception and truth. The room held its breath without realizing it, as identity and authority quietly prepared to intersect in a way no one present had anticipated. The morning air over the small suburban cemetery felt unusually heavy, as if the world itself had slowed down to honor the moment. Rows of white chairs faced a modest wooden podium, and the soft rustle of leaves in the trees mixed with distant church bells ringing somewhere beyond the neighborhood. The woman stood near the front row, dressed in a simple black suit, her posture steady but her eyes carrying the quiet exhaustion of someone holding back too many emotions at once. She was there for her son, and every second of the service felt like it was both necessary and unbearable at the same time. Behind her, family members and close friends remained silent, offering presence more than words. The atmosphere was deeply respectful, fragile, and controlled, as though everyone understood that the smallest disruption would break something that could not be repaired. On the edge of the cemetery entrance, however, a police vehicle slowly rolled in, its presence subtle at first, almost unnoticed among the trees and parked cars. Two officers stepped out, scanning the area with professional focus, their attention drawn by a routine report about a possible disturbance related to traffic near the service. The lead officer, a man in his 40s with a calm but authoritative demeanor, adjusted his uniform and approached with measured steps, unaware of the emotional weight of what he was walking into. The second officer followed slightly behind, holding a small notepad, observing the gathering with careful eyes. As they moved closer, their communication remained quiet and procedural, focused on verifying information rather than making assumptions. The woman noticed their approach only when they reached the outer edge of the gathering, and she turned slightly, her expression shifting from grief to cautious attention. The lead officer spoke respectfully, asking simple questions about who was in charge of the gathering and whether any permits had been issued for the temporary street closure near the cemetery entrance. His tone was neutral, careful, and professional, but the timing of his arrival created an immediate tension in the air. Several attendees exchanged uneasy glances, not because of hostility, but because grief and interruption rarely coexist peacefully. The woman stepped forward slightly, her voice steady as she explained that this was a private funeral service and that arrangements had been handled through the funeral director and local administration. The officer listened, nodding, but continued to reference procedural details that suggested some confusion in the local coordination. The second officer quietly checked radio communications, trying to clarify the situation in real time. For a moment, it felt like nothing more than a bureaucratic misunderstanding unfolding in an inappropriate place. Still, the emotional weight of the funeral made every sentence feel amplified, every pause more significant than it should have been. The woman remained composed, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze steady even as the interruption pressed against the boundaries of her patience. Those who knew her well noticed the way she held herself, not with defiance, but with controlled restraint shaped by years of discipline and responsibility. The officers, still unaware of her full identity and professional standing, continued their verification process, focused only on ensuring compliance with local protocol. The situation had not escalated, but it had reached a point where every word mattered more than it should in a place meant for remembrance and peace. The air remained still, the gathering frozen between mourning and procedure, as if the entire moment was waiting for something important to be understood. The quiet tension around the cemetery deepened as the officers' questions continued, each one delivered with the same professional calm, but now carrying a subtle sense of urgency as he tried to reconcile conflicting information from dispatch. The woman remained in place near the front of the gathering, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, but the emotional strain behind her eyes grew more visible as the interruption continued during a moment meant for remembrance. Around her, mourners shifted uncomfortably, not out of confrontation, but out of the natural discomfort that arises when a sacred moment is interrupted by procedure. The second officer stepped slightly to the side, scanning the perimeter again, noting the respectful arrangement of chairs, floral displays, and the clearly organized structure of the service, which made it increasingly clear that this was not an uncontrolled situation. A soft wind moved through the trees, carrying the sound of distant traffic, contrasting sharply with the stillness of the gathering. The lead officer lowered his voice further, asking for confirmation of who had authorized the partial use of the roadside near the cemetery entrance, explaining that they had received a complaint about temporary obstruction. The woman answered with calm clarity, stating that all arrangements had been handled through official funeral coordination channels and confirmed by local administrative staff, her tone controlled but firm. There was no anger in her voice, only the quiet precision of someone accustomed to speaking carefully under pressure. The officer listened, his expression unchanged, but his attention began to shift as he processed the details she provided. A brief pause followed, during which the atmosphere seemed to tighten slightly, not from conflict, but from the weight of misunderstanding lingering unresolved. In that moment, the woman's identity remained unknown to the officers, yet her presence carried an unmistakable sense of authority that had not yet been recognized. The second officer checked his device again, reviewing updated notes from dispatch, while subtly observing the woman's calm composure and the way others in the gathering seemed to defer to her presence. A subtle shift began to form in the interaction, as the procedural tone of the conversation started to give way to cautious reassessment. The lead officer adjusted his stance, now speaking with a slightly more measured tone, acknowledging that there may have been miscommunication in the initial report. The woman gave a small nod, her focus still anchored in the reason she was there, despite the interruption that had disrupted the emotional flow of the ceremony. The environment remained respectful but tense, not due to hostility, but due to the collision of two very different realities sharing the same space at the same moment. The funeral procession in the background remained still, waiting for resolution, while the officers quietly reassessed their understanding of the situation. Every detail now felt more significant, as if the truth of the moment was slowly beginning to surface beneath layers of assumption and procedure. The atmosphere around the funeral shifted again as the lead officer subtly stepped back half a pace, creating more space between himself and the woman while he reviewed the new confirmation on his device. His expression changed in a barely noticeable way, not dramatic, but enough to signal that the information he was receiving was beginning to conflict with his earlier assumptions. The second officer also slowed his movements, no longer scanning the scene as if searching for a problem, but instead observing the people present with a more attentive and thoughtful approach. The woman remained composed, her hand steady, her gaze fixed toward the memorial area where the service was meant to continue, but the interruption had not yet fully cleared. Behind her, a few family members exchanged quiet glances, sensing a subtle shift in tone even if they did not fully understand what was changing. The lead officer cleared his throat slightly and adjusted his stance again, now speaking with a more formal and respectful cadence, asking for clarification regarding her identity in a way that was noticeably different from his earlier questioning. The woman responded calmly, offering her credentials with precision, explaining that she was the presiding federal judge assigned to the district, and that she had been attending the service in a personal capacity. The moment she spoke those words, the dynamic in the space changed immediately. The officers did not react with visible shock, but their posture and attention shifted in clear recognition of the significance of what had just been stated. The second officer lowered his device slightly, focusing fully on her as the implications of the situation became clear. The lead officer took a brief pause, then acknowledged her statement with a respectful nod, his tone becoming measured and careful as he expressed understanding and began to reassess the earlier report that had brought them there. The surrounding mourners, while still quiet, began to sense that the tension was dissolving into something more procedural and less uncertain. The woman did not display satisfaction or frustration, only a calm stillness that reflected both emotional restraint and professional discipline. A light breeze passed through the cemetery again, moving gently across the rows of chairs and floral arrangements, as if signaling a return to order. The lead officer quietly requested confirmation of the complaint details from dispatch, now focusing on resolving the misunderstanding rather than enforcing it. The The second officer stepped slightly closer to review the notes as well, and both men exchanged a brief glance that indicated mutual understanding without words. The woman remained present but no longer the subject of uncertainty, her role now recognized, her authority acknowledged. The environment softened perceptibly as the procedural tension gave way to respect, allowing the funeral service to move closer to resuming its intended course. As the procedural tension fully settled across the cemetery, the environment shifted into a quieter and more respectful rhythm, with attendees gradually returning their attention to the ongoing service rather than the interruption that had just occurred. The lead officer maintained a professional stance, now positioned slightly farther from the center of attention, signaling that his role had transitioned from intervention to resolution. His communication with dispatch continued in a low, controlled manner, confirming that the initial report had been misinterpreted and that no further action was required beyond documentation. The second officer stood nearby, scanning the area one last time with a calm, observant expression, ensuring that all parties remained stable and that the scene was fully under control. The woman remained composed, her posture unchanged, her focus gently returning toward the ceremony that had been paused. There was no visible agitation in her expression, only a steady sense of presence and restraint that reflected her professional discipline and personal grief. Around her, family members slowly resumed their positions, some adjusting their seating while others quietly exchanged words of comfort, the atmosphere gradually returning to its intended solemnity. The lead officer concluded his communication and offered a brief, respectful acknowledgement toward the woman, recognizing the misunderstanding without drawing further attention to it. The second officer followed with a similar gesture, subtle and restrained, consistent with the formal tone of the moment. The woman responded with a simple nod, acknowledging the resolution without lingering on the disruption. A few seconds passed in near silence, broken only by the distant sound of wind moving through trees and the soft rustle of programs being held by attendees. The officiant of the service, who had remained waiting at a distance, slowly stepped forward again, signaling that the ceremony could continue. His voice, when it resumed, was measured and calm, carefully guiding the gathering back into its intended sequence. The emotional weight of the moment remained present, but it was no longer overshadowed by confusion or interruption. Instead, there was a collective sense of regained focus, as everyone present gradually recentered on the purpose of the gathering. The woman took a slow breath, her attention fully returning to the ceremony, standing among her family with quiet dignity. The officers remained in place for a brief moment longer, ensuring stability before preparing to leave the immediate area. As they finally began to step away, their movements were unhurried and professional, indicating that their presence was no longer required. The space around the ceremony felt more unified again, as respect and order replaced uncertainty, allowing the service to proceed with the dignity it was meant to hold. The final stretch of the moment unfolded in a quieter emotional register as the ceremony regained its natural rhythm, with the officiant continuing the service in a steady and respectful tone that guided everyone deeper into reflection and remembrance. The woman stood among her family, her posture calm but visibly present, her attention now fully aligned with the words being spoken. There was a subtle change in the atmosphere, not dramatic, but meaningful, as the earlier disruption had faded into the background and been replaced by a shared sense of focus and collective mourning. The officers, having confirmed that no further intervention was necessary, remained at a respectful distance for a few moments longer, their presence now purely observational and non-intrusive. The lead officer checked the surroundings one final time, ensuring that all situational details were stable, then quietly signaled to his partner that they could begin to disengage from the immediate area. Their movements were measured and deliberate, reflecting standard procedure and respect for the setting. As they turned slightly away from the gathering, the weight of their earlier misunderstanding appeared to settle into a professional acknowledgement of how quickly assumptions can shift under unclear circumstances. The second officer offered a brief glance back toward the ceremony, then returned his focus forward as they walked slowly along the path leading away from the service area. Behind them, the sound of the officiant's voice continued, steady and composed, carrying across the rows of attendees who now sat in attentive silence. A few family members gently adjusted their posture, leaning forward slightly as the memorial reading progressed, while others held hands or bowed their heads in quiet reflection. The woman remained still, her expression composed but reflective, as if absorbing both the words being spoken and the emotional weight of the day. There was no further interruption, no renewed tension, only the steady continuation of the ceremony that had been restored to its intended dignity. The environment itself seemed to settle, as if the earlier disruption had been absorbed into the larger emotional context of the moment and no longer defined it. The officers reached the edge of the visible area and paused briefly to confirm over radio that the situation was fully resolved, their tone calm and procedural. After that final confirmation, they moved beyond the immediate space, leaving the gathering entirely in the care of the family and officiant. What remained was a restored sense of continuity, where grief, memory, and respect were once again the only forces shaping the moment. The ceremony proceeded forward without further incident, each word spoken by the officiant reinforcing the solemn purpose of the gathering, while those in attendance remained united in silence and remembrance. The ceremony continued in a steady emotional rhythm as time seemed to slow within the quiet space, with every attendee gradually settling deeper into reflection while the officiant's voice maintained a calm and respectful cadence that honored both memory and presence. The woman remained seated with her family, her hands resting gently in her lap, her gaze occasionally shifting toward the framed photograph positioned near the front of the gathering. There was a sense of quiet strength in her posture, not dramatic or expressive, but steady and grounded as she absorbed the weight of the moment. Around her, family members shared subtle gestures of support, brief touches on shoulders and hands that conveyed connection without words. The environment had fully returned to its intended state, where grief and remembrance were the only defining emotions in the space. A soft breeze moved through the outdoor setting, lightly shifting the edges of floral arrangements placed near the memorial display, adding a gentle sense of motion to an otherwise still atmosphere. In the distance, faint ambient sounds from the surrounding neighborhood blended softly with the ceremony, but they never disrupted the focus of those gathered. The officiant reached a reflective segment of the service, speaking about legacy, memory, and the quiet impact of a life remembered, and his voice carried evenly across the seated attendees. Several individuals lowered their heads further, while others closed their eyes briefly, each processing the words in their own personal way. The woman's expression remained composed, her breathing slow and steady, as if she was carefully holding each memory close without letting it overwhelm her. The earlier presence of law enforcement was now fully absent from the visible scene, leaving no trace of interruption, only the uninterrupted continuation of the ceremony's purpose. The atmosphere felt unified again, with every attendee aligned in shared respect and emotional presence. The officiant paused briefly, allowing silence to fill the space, and in that silence, the weight of collective remembrance became even more pronounced. No one spoke, no one moved beyond small natural adjustments, and the entire gathering seemed to exist in a single moment of quiet understanding. The woman's family stood together briefly for a reading, then gently returned to their seats, maintaining a quiet cohesion as the ceremony moved toward its concluding remarks. The overall tone remained solemn but stable, with no further disruptions, only the steady continuation of remembrance as the service approached its final moments. The final moments of the ceremony arrived with a quiet sense of closure as the officiant gently shifted into his concluding words, speaking about remembrance, continuity, and the way love and memory remain present even after a life has passed, and his voice carried with calm steadiness across the gathered family and friends. The woman sat still, her posture composed, her attention fully directed toward the front where the framed photograph remained the focal point of the space, now surrounded by softly arranged flowers that marked the significance of the day. There was no rush in the environment, only a gradual emotional settling as attendees prepared themselves for the transition from formal ceremony to private farewell. The surrounding group began to rise slowly in small clusters, careful and respectful in their movements, as if unwilling to break the emotional atmosphere too abruptly. The woman's family gathered around her once more, offering quiet support through gentle presence rather than words, forming a close circle that reflected unity and shared remembrance. The officiant offered a final moment of silence, and the entire space responded by becoming completely still, with even the faint background sounds of the neighborhood fading into near invisibility. During this silence, the woman closed her eyes briefly, taking in the weight of memory and presence in a controlled and steady breath before reopening them with calm resolve. As the silence concluded, the ceremony officially came to its end, and attendees began to approach one another in soft exchanges of condolences and comfort, maintaining a respectful tone throughout. The woman remained in place for a few moments longer, allowing others to move ahead of her, her expression composed and reflective, carrying both the heaviness of loss and the steadiness of endurance. Gradually, she rose with her family, and together they moved toward the exit path of the gathering space, walking at a measured pace that reflected the emotional significance of what had just taken place. There were no abrupt movements, only slow and deliberate transitions as the group prepared to leave the ceremonial area behind. The environment outside the central space remained calm, with sunlight gently illuminating the surroundings and creating a soft contrast to the emotional weight of the interior moments. As the woman stepped further away from the gathering, she paused briefly, looking back one final time toward the memorial display, acknowledging the significance of the moment without words. Then, with her family beside her, she continued forward, leaving the space in quiet unity as the ceremony concluded and the day moved gently into its next chapter.